And you might be thinking, well, what's a guy that owns a comic shop doing giving a talk at a horror festival? Hello. Welcome and thank you for coming to my talk. My name is Regie Rigby and I am the owner of Destination Venus, Harrogate's independent comic store. And you might be thinking, well, what's a guy that owns a comic shop doing giving a talk at a horror festival? And I get that, I do. Because when people think of horror fiction, there is a tendency to think of films and novels. But there have been horror comics, pretty much for as long as comics have existed. There's something about that blend of images and written text that just lends itself to the horror genre. Just how far back we can trace the origins of horror comics depends on how we define them. If I really, really wanted to push it, I could point you at a 12th century Japanese scroll called the Gakizoshi, or the Scroll of the Hungry Ghost. But if we're going to talk English language, and that largely means US horror comics, then I guess things got started in the 1930s, as horror tropes and devices started to appear in comics that were actually based around different genres, such as crime. And that's not surprising. Mad scientists, vampires, and monsters of all kinds were a massive part of the horror movies of the 1930s. And so, obviously, those elements were gonna get incorporated into other media. So, if we have to pick a place to start, and we kinda do, I guess 1935's New Fun Comics issue 6 is as good a place as any. New Fun was an anthology title, and it featured stories from various genres. Issue 6 is notable because it contained the first story about Dr. Occult, the ghost detective, who in that particular story was taking down a vampire. Co-created by the writer Jerry Siegel and the artist Joe Shuster, the team who 3 years later would come together to create Superman, Dr. Occult is basically just a supernatural private eye in the style of Philip Marlowe, say. But Dr. Occult's antagonists were evil supernatural creatures, rather than crime bosses and monsters. Although he's never really been regarded as a major character, Dr. Occult does still turn up in comics to this day, and he in fact has the distinction of being the longest running character in the DC universe. But it was in the 40s, really, when the genre took off in comics, probably as a result of demand from US service personnel in the Second World War. Comics were a light, portable, disposable entertainment source. They were easy and relatively cheap for the folks back home to send out to the boys who were serving. And so the more adult-orientated genres, such as horror, were hugely popular with the troops. Often, as in the previous decade, horror tropes were incorporated into other genres, but we were also beginning to see comic adaptations of literary classics, such as Dracula and Frankenstein. And it was a strip featuring Frankenstein's creature called The New Adventures of Frankenstein, which kind of updated Mary Shelley's much adapted and much abused character, that turned a series called Prize Comics into what is regarded by many as the first ongoing American comics title to focus primarily on horror. Created by the writer-artist Dick Briefer, the strip started in Prize Comics issue 7, which came out in December 1940, and ran for 5 years, ending in Prize Comics 54 in April 1945. Other people would actually point you at the launch of a comic called E for the real beginning And that was in late 1946. It's cover dated January 1947, but ignore that. Cover dates in comics are essentially to be taken with a pinch of salt, even to this day. And Eerie issue 1 is certainly the earliest example of something in the style that is now most associated with that golden age of American horror comics. It's a little bit lurid, it's a little bit sensationalist, it's a bit schlocky, to be honest. And it features a sort of Max Schreck-style Nosferatu vampire bearing down on the bound figure of a young woman who's lying in the ruins of an ancient stone temple wearing a pretty revealing evening dress. Oddly, in spite of its success, the title then disappeared for a few years before reappearing, as if by magic, with a new issue 1 in 1951. But that really was the opening of a floodgate, which unfortunately unleashed a torrent that led horror comics in America to attract some very unwanted attention. There's one company in particular, EC Comics, had picked up the horror ball and just ran with it, producing titles like Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror, which we still recognise to this day. It spawned a fleet of imitators, and the whole thing became a runaway mainstream hit in the first half of the 1950s, introducing characters like the Crypt Keeper and just really getting a grip on the public imagination. It really is genuinely hard to overstate how popular horror comics became with the adult audience in America in the early 50s. But not everybody was a fan. Although horror comics had never been marketed towards kids, the popular misconception that comics were a medium just for kids had begun to take hold. And so, as often happens in popular culture, a vocal minority of people decided that horror comics were a thing that the children needed to be protected from. Now, given the paranoia and judgmentalism that was so deeply rooted in the America of the mid-1950s, it seems likely that horror comics would have run into some kind of trouble at some point. But there was, in fact, a very clear spark that lit the powder keg that blew away not just horror comics, but very nearly did for American comics in general. And that was the 1954 book, Seduction of the Innocent, The Influence of Comic Books on Today's Youth, by the psychiatrist Dr. Frederick Wortham, a man who is still kind of a hate figure in comics culture even today. In the book, which became a minor bestseller, Dr. Wortham made the assertion that the violence and gore which featured so heavily in the horror comics of the day was inspiring young readers to engage in similar behaviours, and that these comics were in fact a direct contributor to what he claimed was a serious rise in juvenile delinquency. Essentially, this claim was based on his observation that most of the juvenile delinquents he saw in his practice as a psychiatrist had, at some time in their lives, read comics. And he extrapolated from there that it was therefore the comics that were causing the behaviour. Now, Wortham was frankly a little unhinged and obsessive in his crusade against comics. He railed against not just the violence and gore of horror comics, but also what he called perverted sex and homoeroticism, which he saw everywhere at the slightest provocation. But the public was in the mood for a moral panic, and the public bought the argument. I mean, the flaw in the logic is obvious, of course. These kids that Wortham was seeing had probably also all watched baseball or drunk milk. There were any number, I'm sure, of common threads in the lives of these 50s American kids. To pick out one thing and say that's the cause of the problem, clearly absurd. Clearly absurd. But it's an attitude to recognise. The same arguments were used against the so-called video nasties of the 1980s, against the shoot-'em-up video games in the 90s, and whatever it is that people are upset about now. But we can't just dismiss the public outcry. It was very loud and it was very real in some quarters. There was a congressional inquiry set up. In some parts of America, there were organized events where people were encouraged to turn up and participate in mass burnings of comics. In Oklahoma, Texas, and California, there were attempts in the state legislatures to ban crime and horror comics altogether. The comic companies could see which way the wind was blowing, and rather than wait for the government to just legislate them out of existence, publishers got together and agreed a system of regulations that they would apply to themselves. That was the birth of the Comics Code Authority, and for a while, it was the death of the American horror comic. Adopted in 1954, the Comics Code was never legally binding, but for decades, advertisers were unwilling to place adverts in comics that hadn't earned the right to display the approved by the Comics Code Authority logo on the cover. There was also a widely held belief in the industry that nobody would want to buy a book that didn't have that Caesar's seal of approval. But while the code did not expressly ban horror comics, the restrictions that it placed made horror comics pretty much impossible to make. Excessive violence was banned. So was anything that the CCA judged to be a lurid, unsavoury, or gruesome illustration. The code also prohibited explicitly vampires, werewolves, ghouls, and zombies. And if all that was not bad enough, the code also forbade publishers from using the words terror or horror in the title of a publication. And that really could have been the end of it. But of course, thankfully, it was not. By the 1960s, although the CCA remained strong, the counterculture was getting going, and some stores that catered to the freewheeling hippie movement began to carry independently produced comics that didn't bother about CCA approval. Now, at the time, these were not horror comics. These were mostly comics about drug culture. But they were the seed of something that would bear gloriously horrifying fruit in the future. The idea that an independent publisher could just publish what they wanted, and the CCA could do nothing about it. And it's fair to say, horror tropes continue to find their way into mainstream code-approved titles. The most obvious example will be the gamma-fueled Jekyll and Hyde-inspired behemoth of the Incredible Hulk. Created for Marvel Comics in 1962 by writer Stan Lee and artist Jack "The King" Kirby, the Incredible Hulk has always been more of a monster than a superhero. And in recent years, Al Ewing, who currently writes the book now known as The Immortal Hulk, has really kind of leaned in to those horror roots, taking Hulk to hell and having him have to deal with more monstrous than villainous foes. And Hulky isn't the only character to draw on such horror tropes. Over at DC Comics, they've been experimenting with horror-style stuff that could survive CCA scrutiny throughout the 60s. Varying degrees of success, but they were trying. And with most of the staple horror characters, such as vampires and werewolves and such, off limits, they had to get creative. And in 1971, the long-running anthology title, House of Secrets, featured the first appearance of the character that would arguably go on to revive the horror genre in mainstream American comics. We're talking about Swamp Thing. Created by writer Len Wein and artist Bernie Wrightson, and not to be confused with the very similar Man-Thing published over at Marvel, Swamp Thing is essentially an anthropomorphic pile of animated vegetable matter, initially fighting to defend his swampland home, but eventually the entire world from a variety of supernatural and environmental threats. He was very popular in the early 70s, but it was in the 80s when he really came into his own. The 80s were a decade of immense change in American comics. The Comics Code was still very much in effect, but creators were starting to push against the boundaries. stories were becoming darker and grittier and more realistic, influenced by the movies of the day. And against that background, a group of writers and artists from Britain started to get work with the big American publishers. One member of that so-called British invasion was a beardy young wizard from Northampton called Alan Moore. Saga of the Swamp Thing had been relaunched in 1982, written by Martin Pascoe and edited by the character's co-creator, Len Wein. When Pascoe left the book to take on more lucrative TV work, Wein hired Alan Moore. Not long after that, Wein left the book and was replaced in the editorial position by the now legendary Karen Berger. And Berger gave Moore completely free rein to reboot the character however he saw fit. If you know anything about Alan Moore, you'll know that that's a dangerous thing to say to him. Because he did. He changed pretty much everything. He dumped most of the supporting cast, and he retconned the character's origin to make him more of a monster, more horrific, and much, much less relatably human. He also began to bring in more supernatural themes, including introducing the Liverpudlian sorcerer John Constantine. The book began to examine more complex horror-rooted themes, and eventually, Alan Moore pushed the Comics Code Authority a little bit too far. It was Saga of the Swamp Thing, issue 29, that really did it. It was a story called Love and Death, which featured both sex and violence, and horror. A lot. The Comics Code Authority refused to approve it, demanded extensive changes. But backed up by his editor Karen Berger, Alan Moore flatly refused to change a single thing. So the CCA had no choice. They had to say, well, in that case, you can't put the logo on the cover. They couldn't say you can't publish the comic because the code was never legally binding. They just assumed that if they said you can't have our logo, the company that was publishing the comic would always back down. In the past, they always had. But demonstrating a frankly uncharacteristic amount of backbone, because DC Comics, even today, is regarded as the small c conservative, ultra-cautious comics publisher. DC Comics looked the CCA straight in the eye and said, all right then, we'll publish it without the logo. It's fine. More than that, they then just never bothered sending another issue of Swamp Thing to be reviewed by the CCA. And you know what? Absolutely nothing happened. Sales didn't fall. Nobody wrote to protest. Retailers didn't refuse to stock it. There were literally no negative consequences. And a new generation of comics creators sat up and took some serious notice. Following Alan Moore's footsteps, British writer Neil Gaiman began The Sandman, an epic tale of the endless, an immortal family of powerful beings, each one the embodiment of a human concept. There was destiny, death, destruction, dream, desire, despair, and delirium. A 75-issue tale of horror and darkness and family drama that is considered still to be a classic. Spinning out of the saga of the Swamp Thing, John Constantine became the star of his own book called Hellblazer. And there were other titles that were starting to mess with the supernatural, the strange, and the horrific. And then, in the early 90s, Karen Berger, who was already the go-to editor at DC for anything weird, Karen Berger was put in charge of a new adult-orientated imprint at DC called Vertigo Comics. And Vertigo ignored the Comics Code Authority entirely. Suddenly, there was space in the mainstream of American comics where horror comics were welcome. and they thrived. The rest, pretty much history. As the 90s progressed, comics culture went through some major changes. The importance of the big two, Marvel and DC, began to wane, and new independent publishers, some of which had grown out of them, the indie tradition of those hippie shops in the 60s, began to gain popularity and readership. And they didn't bother with the CCA either. So they could also publish whatever they wanted. It wasn't all plain sailing. There were some dreadful missteps in the 90s, but the medium properly grew up. It would be 2011 before the Comics Code finally wound itself up. But by 1992, it had lost its teeth. It had lost its power, and nobody took it seriously anymore. And in the last 20 years, comics have truly embraced the horror genre, producing stories and series that have influenced the genre of horror as a whole. You may remember the vampire story 30 Days of Night as a 2007 movie, but it was a comic first and, if I may say so, a better comic than it was a movie. And if we're going to talk about horror comics that became ridiculously successful in other media, we should probably mention Robert Kirkman's The Walking Dead, which launched as a little black and white indie comic from Image Comics in 2003. Originally illustrated by the artist Tony Moore, then for more than a decade and a half by Charlie Adlard, the comic ran for 16 years and probably counts as the most successful horror comic in history. It's certainly the best seller in the English language. It was so successful that since its surprising ending in 2019, and it was a surprise, nobody knew that last issue was going to be the last issue until they got to the last page, they've actually started reprinting the series from the beginning in colour under the title The Walking Dead Deluxe. And in spite of being a reprint series, it sells in really high numbers. And then, apparently there's a TV show. Right now, we are living in something of a golden age for horror comics. In just the last few months, we've seen the launch of books like Miskatonic, where a plucky female FBI agent in the 1930s is pitched against ancient Lovecraftian monsters. There's Maniac of New York, a psychological twist on the gritty 70s slasher genre. The plot, a sort of highbrow generational family haunting story, has come to an end. We've had erotic pseudo-vampirism in a book called Heartbeat, anti-colonial 19th century vampires in These Savage Shores, and so on, and so on, and so on. The list is huge and growing. Horror is a genre that really lends itself to comics. Visions that would be too expensive or even impossible to commit to film can be rendered in comics at the stroke of a pen. The visual effects budget in comics is unlimited, and comics are cheaper to make than films, and you can do them on your own. You don't need a cast, you don't need a crew. So if you want to see some of the most innovative visual horror storytelling you will ever see from creative young people who haven't been able to get a rung on the movie-making ladder yet, check out the horror section of your local comic store. I'll see you there.